What's up, YouTube pards? Merry Christmas. Welcome back to the High Noon Leatherworks channel. And I'm Jack Spade here with you. And we're on our second episode of building the Hand of God holster. So come on in a little closer and I'll show you what we're doing today. Alright, what we're doing today is we're moving to the next step in this Hand of God holster project. And what I did was, on the last episode, we did the grooving on the outsides, and I went ahead and grooved my outline here. I did a double groove on my outline for where my floral pattern is going to be carved in there. And this is the first time we've done some carving on this channel. So the first thing I did is I found me a nice floral pattern, and I took some wax paper and I took a Sharpie, a fine tip Sharpie, and I went over that floral pattern and just traced it out. And before I did that, after I got my border where I was going to put my floral pattern, I went ahead and put my wax paper over there and drew me a dotted line with my Sharpie around those grooves. And what that does is that allows me to look at different patterns and lay it out and see which one's going to fit inside of here in that dotted line and how I want that to fit inside of that grooved outline. So I found one that I liked, I traced it out on wax paper. Then once I have it traced out on wax paper, I take clear box tape and I tape over that with clear box tape. And I think this took like 3 or 4 pieces. And I go across where I've actually used my Sharpie and done the tracing. And what that does is when I get ready to take my tool and copy this onto my leather, that keeps this from ripping or tearing, and then I can use it again later if I want. So I can hang on to this and it'll last several times. If you don't put that layer of tape on there to strengthen that, then you get about 1 use out of a piece of wax paper and that's it. So I'm going to be using my pattern, traced pattern. Obviously I'm going to be using my holster leather. I'm going to be using some painter's tape to hold my pattern down so it doesn't move. And then I'm going to be using a swivel knife, a swivel blade knife, and that's for my carving. So I'll show you how we use that here as soon as we get started carving. So the first thing I'm going to do is set all this aside except for my holster, and I'm going to go ahead and case my leather because I want to be able to trace that image into that leather. And the best way to do that is to go ahead and case that. And you guys you go back into some of my earlier videos, we did some casing before we did some stamping, and same thing holds true with carving. We're going to case our leather first, and you just do that with tap water. I use a sponge. Again, we want to try to get that cased evenly. So that we don't discolor our leather. Again, we don't want to soak it. You don't want your sponge soaking wet. You just want it damp. We want that leather damp enough that we can put an image into it. I'm going to go ahead and lightly case the whole entire piece so I don't discolor anything, even though I'm not going to be carving back here on the back side. I'm going to go ahead ahead and moisten that all over. Case that. That way when it dries, it'll all dry the same shade. And I'll put my casing sponge back in the water, put my lid on, set it aside, and I'm going to let this sit here until it comes back, the color starts coming back. And once that color starts coming back into that leather to its original shade, then we can go ahead and start doing our tracing of our pattern. So I'll go ahead and let that come back, and once it comes back, I'll go ahead and put on my pattern on top. I'll tape it down to my work surface, and then I'll start doing my tracing. So as soon as this is cased, I'll come back. Okay, our leather is ready now. I'll go ahead and make sure I get my image centered in my outline where I'm going to do my carving. Get that image exactly where I want it. And then I'll take some painter's tape and I'll tape that down to my work surface so it doesn't move. Now, I suggest that you do not tape down your piece of leather because it has a tendency to pull that adhesive back off of the tape onto your leather, and then what it does is it discolors the edge of the leather where you tape it on the leather. So it's not a real good idea to tape down your leather itself. So the leather is pretty heavy and you can hold it, and if you tape down your pattern on top of it that you're going to trace, then you have kind of a free hand to hold that leather down. It's not going to move underneath there. It's weighted enough that it's going to stay put. So I'll tape that down in several places so it doesn't move. Again, refraining from taping onto my leather because I don't want that tape adhesive touching my leather. I'll get a stylus. I use a stylus that has a round ball on the end of it so that it doesn't puncture or scratch my leather as I'm tracing, and that leaves a nice wide line for me to carve on, and I'll show you that as soon as I get through and pull this pattern off. And you don't have to press really hard, just firm. Just press firm, and you want to use nice even strokes as you're tracing this on your leather. So you go ahead and pick a corner to start in, and remember, you don't want to go outside of your grooved outline, so really pay attention. You can see through this wax paper, so only go to that inside grooved line. Don't cross over it or that indentation is going to stay there. So I'll go ahead and start tracing this. Make sure you trace all of the lines, and then once you have all the lines traced, I'll come back and I'll show you where we go from there. Alright, once you have all of your lines traced in there inside of your grooved outline, you can go ahead and take the tape off of your pattern. And then you'll have your floral pattern traced into your leather. And you can see how I stayed right inside that inside grooved line. And we're going to do some stamping on the outside of that outside line. So that'll bring that all together. So the next step is I want to take my swivel knife, take a scrap piece of leather, and I'll take some jeweler's rouge, and I'll strop that knife and get it polished up real nice and sharp. And I may do that several times as I'm doing my carving. And I try to do it the same number of times on each side. And that'll keep my knife real nice and polished and keep it nice and sharp. Now, this swivel knife has a finger rest on it, and that swivels around. So what that does is that allows you, it's knurled here so you can grip it, and what that does is that allows you to spin this blade but keep your finger straight as you're carving. So you keep your finger rested on that little stirrup, and as you carve or cut, you can turn your knife. And it does take a little practice to get used to it. I like to keep my leather in a position that I can turn it also. Sometimes it makes it a little bit easier. And again, you're going to start, I always like to start in a corner. And this knife blade is beveled. I don't know if you could see that in the camera, but it's got a beveled blade on it. So what that does is as it cuts into the leather, it also pushes it out a little bit, and that's where you're going to be able to get your stamping tools in there and create some depth. And again, as you're carving, you want to be really careful, just like stamping or grooving. You want to move slowly and carefully to get those round edges round. You got to be so careful, because if you cut off of a mark, it's going to be impossible to fix that. You're going to have to try to hide it some way without going back and starting all over with a new piece of leather. So you just have to be really careful when you're doing your carving. And it can fatigue your hand and your fingers. So as you are doing your carving with your swivel knife, you may need to stop, take a break, and it's kind of a trial and error thing. You kind of have to practice a little bit on the depth, because obviously you want to try to keep it as consistent as possible on the depth of your cuts, and that's why you may need to sharpen your swivel knife as you carve. Casing the leather makes it a lot easier to carve, and it's going to help keep that carved image down in that leather. I don't know if you can see the depth already starting to take shape from where I'm carving down into the leather. So I'll go ahead, finish this carving up, and then I'll be back. Okay, all my lines are carved that I had traced off my pattern. And you can start seeing the actual depth now of the carving. Now once we start putting our stamping in there and we're going to do some beveling and some burnishing, some backgrounding, you're going to see this thing really pop. So there we are, the end of today's episode. We've got our carving started, and we've got our depth actually carved into our holster, the hand of God. On the next episode, we'll come back and we'll start doing some beveling, and we'll do some other decorative stamping on this, backgrounding, and we'll use a mule foot in a few places, and you'll really see this thing start coming together as far as the carving. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you and your family have a Merry Christmas, and I'm going to try to stick another video in here, the next episode of this, hopefully between Christmas and New Year's. And if not, have a Happy New Year. And as I always say, like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video.